So now that we've got all these set up and explained, now we're going to kind of apply this to our next speech and think about how, how the most effective ways persuasion might happen. Okay, so speech two. Why don't some of you might be looking at speech two and going, Mizzo, why do you make us talk about policy? I don't care about policy, Mizzo. I don't like policy. I don't even really get it. I don't want to think about it. I just want to persuade, Mizzo. You made me inform. Most people want to persuade. They don't even want to inform, right? Well, if I just let you jump into persuasion, most people do it very badly. And I don't mean that to be mean. I don't mean that to be like, you're bad at it. I mean, like, they do things in a way that are not persuasive. I often think of like, when you get into talks with someone and they'll very quickly start to be like, that's stupid. Your belief in that is stupid. Well, yeah, you can claim that, but you aren't persuasive at all, right? If you just start telling me that, that's not persuasive, right? Which of these would be the easiest or the hardest to persuade someone? I miss class right now because usually people have different answers, right? So hopefully you're thinking or shouting out an answer. Which one do you think would be the easiest to persuade people to change and the hardest to persuade people to change? All right, so to try to figure this out, let's use an example. Some of you are probably cat people. Any cat people? And some of you are probably dog people. Any dog people? Okay. Could any amount of persuasion... Now, for those of you that don't have strong feelings either way, just observe from the sidelines. This won't really apply to you because you don't have a strong... right? And I said opinion, but can you already see where this might fall on here? Right? So we have cat people and dog people. So either pick a side, right? Figure out where you go or watch from the sidelines. For those of you that have a strong feeling about this, would any amount of talking change your mind? Could I convince you, in any amount of time to not be a dog person, to not be a cat person? You're probably going, no. No. Now, let's say you're a dog person, all right? And I'm making this up for the sake of an example. Let's say you're a dog person and you find out that because of the pandemic, dogs are being adopted at very high rates, but cats are not. And in fact, there's lots of cats and the cat shelters are being overrun and they need supplies and food, right? Is there something I could say to persuade you to give time or money to a cat shelter? Right? If I said, these cats need help, if you have even an extra $5, right? Would you potentially donate that to a cat shelter? Now, some of you, I'm not going to get everybody. I'm going to get people who are like, never. I hate cats, never, right? But notice, if you value dogs, there's no way I'm going to ever get you to not value dogs, right? But I might get you, you might not value cats at the same level you value dogs. But you might value animals in general, and dogs more than anything else. But you might not have a very negative belief towards cats, and therefore you might behave positively towards cats. So let's do another quick example. Many of you have sports teams, right? And if I asked you, could I ever get you to change your allegiance to your sports team? That's laughable, right? Can you imagine me in front of a Packers fan being like, here's why you should not like the Packers? I mean, it's laughable, right? I'm never going to change their value. ever, right? No amount of breath is going to make me change that they value the Packers. But I might be able to convince them to root for a different team, right? Or if another team was in trouble and needed support in some way, I might be able to persuade them to behave, in that manner. So behavior is the easiest thing to change. Behavior and attitudes are the easiest two things to change. And then beliefs and values are the most difficult. They're not impossible, but usually, specifically values and often beliefs, take lots of time. So I think back to something you really valued as a young person, right? Or you really believed as a young person. And now over lots of conversations, lots of discussion, lots of understanding, you might have changed these things. You'll often hear about people who were raised religious, and they'll have very deep values in terms of a specific doctrine or religion, and then over the years their experiences and interactions with others slowly change these values and beliefs. Now, I would argue that, so for me, I was raised Methodist and Christian, and I don't identify that way anymore, but a lot of my values are still the same. A lot of my values come from Christianity. It's just I've been persuaded in terms of, other things to, shift how that looks, right? So it's not impossible to change a value. But you're not going to do it in 6 to 8 minutes. You might get people thinking about it, but you're not going to change it in 6 to 8 minutes. So that's why if I left you to your own accord, you might try to do a value speech, right? You might try to tell me why abortion is wrong, or you might try to tell me why we should all be able to own guns, why we should value guns in our society, right? You might try to persuade me that we should, believe in President Trump, right? Whatever that is, you might situate your persuasion up here. And that is not going to be effective. When you get high-level persuasion, baby, you can work your way up, right? I think sometimes my argumentation taps into these, but I stick down here, man. I stick to sources and facts and, tangible things that might eventually get cross-applied up, but then I know I can change. Okay, so here's a great example, I think. I often talk to people, and I know I talk about gender a lot, but that's my field, so it's easy to pull examples. So I hope it's okay. We're gonna do a gender example here, quick. So I often talk to people. People often talk to me because I know I study gender. So people often come to me when they want to talk about transgender individuals or changing a gender, right? Or they'll say, or non-binary, right? Basically, something that is outside of men and women, and they will have very different values than I will about gender and inclusion in bodies and whatnot, right? So I don't start there. I don't try to convince them why they should try to accept transgender individuals, okay? I just don't. I start with the existence of intersex bodies. So I don't even start with transgender. If we're going to talk about gender, and I'm going to try to sort of have a conversation with you to get you to understand some things that you may not know or understand, I'm going to start with intersex bodies. And I'm going to say that, we know how babies are born, and that for the most part they fit into male and female. And the way we know that somebody is male or female is by, do you know this? Chromosomes, hormones, brain structure, and genitals. And genitals gets the big flashy, but that's not the whole story, right? The chromosomes and the hormones and the brain structure have to match. Women have smaller brains, typically men have larger brains. There's a whole bunch of arguments as to which is better. It's hilarious. So sometimes what will happen is, sorry, get my fingers here. Sometimes what will happen is the genitals will not align with the hormones and the chromosomes, right? Does that make sense? So you'll have XY chromosomes, but then, lots of testosterone, right? Or genitals that don't match. Or you'll have genitals that look multiple different ways. And this is called intersex. And it's an umbrella term. There's lots of different ways that this can happen. And I will explain that when babies start out, so we all know I have a baby inside of me, and I had an ultrasound a few weeks ago, and I said, please don't tell me the sex. I don't want to know what it is. And she said, we don't reliably know what it is right now anyway, because all babies start in the same blob. And then men, their genitals go up and down, and women, theirs go in and up, right? So there's a lot of manifestations that can happen. People have been born with ovaries and a penis, right? Or a vagina and testicles. That happens sometimes. And in fact, it happens so often, about 2%, it's about 1.7% of people are born that way. Okay, are you sick of me talking yet? So look at how I'm not starting with opinions about gender and like beliefs and values about gender performance, right? I'm starting at the very basic, like, this happens, this behavior happens. Bodies like this exist, right? So bodies that don't neatly fit into these two categories fit, right? And because those bodies exist, then I believe we need space for those bodies. And usually people are with me. Usually, because then when I tell them, right, people do surgeries on these infants to fix them, even though there's no medical reason to do so, and people are usually like, oh God, that behavior is terrible, right? We don't need to do surgeries on infants, right? Do you see what I'm saying? So if I can get people on board with, like, we don't want to do surgeries on infants, and that if I problematize sex, right, the sex you're born, then you have to problematize gender. Because if I don't have neat boxes for sex, right, and I have that fuzzy middle box, I may not have neat boxes for gender, and then that opens me up into discussions about behavior and attitudes about performing gender. Persuasion, argumentation. Isn't that cool? Isn't that cool? And notice, I mean, sometimes I default to my values and beliefs to show an example, but notice I'm not playing with opinion here. Ain't no way. I'm not, that's too risky, right? I don't, like that article I put up for you to read, I don't give a crap about your opinion, right? Opinion to me is like when you're outside and you're looking down and you're like, the sky is purple. The sky is purple. And I'm like, look up at it. You gotta look up at it. It's like, if you look up at it, we can debate about what shade of blue or purple it is, right? But if you're just stuck on an opinion and you've got no support, no justification, no backup, right? I can't talk to you. I can't persuade you. I can't have a conversation with you if you look up at it and can support that it's a different color than I'm claiming it to be. Now we're in business, right? See the difference? Isn't that cool? Okay, so linking it to your second speech, policy is what creates reality. Policy is how we determine public behavior. Isn't that cool? So if I keep you in policy and you need to take your community concern and find where it hits legislation or rules or, right, then that's how it becomes tangible behavior. Now, policies are just rules or laws, right? And they can happen on the governmental level, right? Excuse me, legislation. And we have that at the federal level and the state level. It can happen at the institutional level, right? So if you're talking about like paying athletes, you're not talking about state or federal policy. You're talking about the NCAA policies, right? Might go all the way down, like you might be talking about school codes. You might be talking about community laws, right? Do you see how all these different levels? That's how we get values, beliefs, and attitudes put into reality, is through policy. Now, there's also something about norms. And the difference between policy and norms are that policies are recorded or written down somewhere and enforced, and norms are socially created and known through social enforcement. So if I show up wearing my bikini to teach class, there is a policy, right, that says I can't wear a bikini because that's inappropriate to teach my class. I have a departmental policy that's written down about dress code. But I might show up in a giant peacock outfit, and that's just not normal. But there's nothing in the policy. As long as my body's covered, I could have peacock feathers everywhere, big old hair, right? That might just be a norm. That you'd all be like, why is she a giant peacock? But that doesn't break the policy. Isn't this board cool? Yeah? So if you're having trouble thinking of policies, message me or set up a time to video chat. Because I'm happy. I can connect anything to policy. Anything you think of, I can connect to policy, right? So some of them are easy. Some of them are inherently policy, right? So thinking about gun control, that's all policy, right? Of how we think about guns. That all comes from the Second Amendment. That's a policy, right? Some of it is going to be more intangible. So if your topic is all about opioids, right? Thinking about how, or you're talking about addiction. Now you're kind of up in this value beliefs area. We want to go and think about, okay, how is addiction or how are opioids, legislated? Well, we might go into like what is legal and what is illegal. I think it's fascinating that marijuana that has very little side effects has been illegal for so many centuries, and you can trace the history, which I think Riley did. Isn't this your topic, Riley? I think you did a beautiful job of tracing the history of why marijuana is not legal, right? And we have a very specific attitude around marijuana versus like alcohol, right, which causes way more death and does harm in more tangible ways than marijuana. And again, I'm not going into my belief, right? I'm not saying you should believe marijuana is better than alcohol. I'm just going down to behavior, right, and attitude in terms of like one causes more death than the other. Okay, some of them are going to be so if you think about like opioids, right? You might, policy-wise, you might think of, like I said, how drugs are legislated or legalized, but you also might think of criminalization, like how is it criminalized? You might also think of policies around treatment, right? Like what do we do when someone is caught with drugs? Do we throw them in jail? Like is that the policy that we throw them in jail, or do we put them in treatment, right? I heard somebody speak one time about sexual violence, and they were saying how they had sat through all of these court cases. And so many times lawyers would argue that what defendants needed was therapy and treatment. And they would say, like, they need this. And she said they argued about it as if there was a set up system in our society to do that, but we don't have one, right? Because our society doesn't value taking care of people like that. They value criminalization over rehabilitation, right? So going down to thinking about like how the policies function, what behavior or options are available in terms of how something is created into reality through policy or rules. A really easy example of how policy creates reality are rape laws. Do you know when we first started writing rape laws? Late 60s. So before the late 60s, it wasn't like people weren't being violated. It just didn't exist in terms of reality. It didn't have a name. It wasn't, there wasn't anything done about it in society because it wasn't in policy, right? No one did anything about it. So you could go and say, someone did this to me, someone raped me, and nothing would happen. It didn't matter because there was no legislation to determine what that meant. So then we started writing rape laws. Well, most of the early rape laws had a lot of very specific standards. So you had to prove that this happened. You couldn't be married to the person. So anytime a husband or a wife violated their spouse, that didn't count as rape because of the way the law was written. And also, most of the laws were written in a very gendered way, so only men couldn't rape other men based on the law, and women couldn't rape men based on the law. Now, we know that's not true in terms of experience, right? In terms of behavior. But in terms of how it was coded into the law, right? So you can see how trying to get that changed, how that putting those into law really changed then how we think about sexual violence in our culture. I could talk about that a long time, so if you've got more questions about that, let me know, or if you need another example, let me know. So this is where we're at. When you start to think about speech 2, you're going to want to think about your community concern. So think about that first speech, think about what you did for that first speech, and then think about how that community concern connects to policy, and how a policy change might help change the community concern, right? Because we're sticking to behavior for this speech. Now, you can also shift a cultural value, and if you shift a cultural value, the policy will change. We saw that with legalization of same-sex marriage a little bit, that like eventually enough people had shifted their values that we changed behavior. But even in terms of that, when Minnesota was doing their amendment, which was a few years before it changed nationally, when they would call people, they wouldn't say, "Do you value gay people?" No, they would say, "Do you value marriage? Do you believe people should be allowed to get married?" And then people would start talking about like, "Yes, I've been married for 35 years and I value blah, blah." And, you know, if you could get people to say, "Do you think everybody should have that right?" Right? Then you could get them to say, "We should legalize gay marriage even if you don't support it." Right? Because you believe that everybody should have the right, even though you don't support gay marriage specifically. People would say, you know, if you had a daughter who was gay, wouldn't you want her to be able to get married? Don't you believe she should be able to get married even though she's not like you? And it worked. So many people voted for that amendment because they valued other people's rights and inclusion, not because they valued gay people, right? Or gay marriage specifically. So the behavior changed because we then shifted the value. Or because we tapped into another connected value to then change the behavior, which now that gay marriage is legal, it's a lot easier to value. Isn't that cool? Okay, I adore you. I hope this helped. Have a beautiful day, and happy arguing.